You've criticised the government this morning for what you call complacency. Now, you personally abstained on the deployment of troops to Afghanistan a decade ago. Just to be clear, before we get into the details, before this summer, did you think it was right that British troops should have been in Afghanistan?
Well, I was sceptical about the reasons for going into Afghanistan 20 years ago, but I very much understood, like many people, that there was a real and present threat from Al-Qaeda that had seen more British citizens that lose their lives than any other apart from the United States in the 9/11 attacks. And there was an urgent and pressing priority to make sure that the capability of Al-Qaeda was degraded, and that also therefore meant taking on the Taliban government that was in charge. I think what became apparent very quickly, though, was that there was a problem with what that led to, the secondary objective, which became, as Joe Biden has said in recent weeks, about nation building and trying to build a democratic, inclusive government in Afghanistan alongside the Afghan people, proved to be something that was far more complicated than those who took us into Afghanistan in the first place envisaged. I think there have been a series of mistakes over the last 20 years by political parties of all persuasions on both sides of the Atlantic. I think at some stage there has to be a lessons learned moment, but what was avoidable and what should have been avoidable was the chaos that we've seen in recent weeks that's left us reliant on the Taliban for permission to evacuate our own citizens and the Afghans who helped us and put many British troops in danger. We had 18 months to plan. We shouldn't have ended up here.
I'll come to that in a second, but if I understand what you said clearly, I just want to be sure that I'm interpreting it properly. You came round to the view that we should have been there, but you thought what we did or how we executed the mission was poor.
No, actually, I think that the work that the British troops did in Afghanistan, working alongside the Afghan people, is seriously underrated. When I talk to friends in Afghanistan, the younger generation who grew up, especially girls, being able to access education, millions of them who would never have had those opportunities, there is a whole generation of young Afghans who have completely different expectations about their lives than the generation that went before because of the work that our British troops did over 2 decades. Not just in terms of education, but landmine clearance, which meant that the economic opportunities for many Afghans were completely transformed. There is a lot to be proud of the work that our British troops did over 20 years. But one of the things that many are now asking is, was it all in vain because of the chaos of the last 18 months? And they are questions that we're going to be putting to the Prime Minister in the House of Commons tomorrow, and that he simply has to be able to answer.
OK, well, the question for you is that do you think, then, that the President of the United States, Mr. Biden, should have stuck to his August the 31st deadline? Or do you think that good work of which you've just spoken should have been continued, irrespective?
I think the problem was the hard deadline. Whether it was August 31st or a different date, the problem was setting a hard deadline for withdrawal. And that's a point that my colleague Emily Thornberry, who was then the Shadow Foreign Secretary, made at the time that the Doha agreement was struck with President Trump, was that a phased withdrawal would have meant that the Afghan troops, the Afghan security forces, we could have continued to work with them in order to support them to continue that battle against the Taliban. But instead, a hard deadline signalled to the Taliban that this was simply a waiting game. They knew that they had until the 31st of August, and then all troops would have withdrawn. And that appears to have had a major impact on the morale of the Afghan forces as well. So we've been very critical of President Biden for that decision.
To be clear, a Labour government would still have British troops in Afghanistan today?
No. No, we've never argued that. Once the United States took a decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, we have accepted the government position that it would have been unsustainable to allow British troops to continue. The Foreign Secretary was asked this week at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, were there efforts made with NATO partners to see if an alternative coalition could have been put together to allow British troops and others to remain in Afghanistan? And he gave an answer which is very consistent with what many of those NATO countries have told me and the Labour leader privately, which is that it would have been completely unsustainable to do that. So the question became, how do you have a chaotic, unorderly withdrawal of troops, and how do you continue to support the Afghan people and protect those gains that we fought for 20 years after we've left? That's what the government ought to have been planning for. They had 18 months and they simply didn't do it.
OK. All right. Now, talking about supporting the Afghan people, we are where we are. Should our government be talking to the Taliban, or should it be supporting Ahmed Massoud and the National Resistance Army in the Panjshir Valley? Can't do both.
I think we have to talk to the Taliban, and we've been urging the government for some time to have a dialogue with the Taliban. We have thousands of people still in Afghanistan, the Afghans who assisted us, but British nationals as well. Some of those cases are very, very complex. The Defence Secretary has been suggesting to MPs that they should, if they can, they should just try to get to the border, any border, and see if they can get across. But without safe passage, many of those people will simply not reach safety. We've got British nationals in wheelchairs, we've got children who've been separated from their parents, we've got somebody who's on dialysis. The truth is that if we want to uphold the promise and commitment that we made to our own citizens and to many Afghans who assisted us over recent decades, we've got to have a dialogue with the Taliban. We've got to ensure as a priority that safe passage across the country. We've got to be talking to the Taliban as well about the functioning airport and whether a country like Turkey or Qatar could somehow guarantee the safe passage of our citizens out of that airport. This is really pressing and urgent, and there is no choice at this current stage but to have a dialogue with the Taliban. That's different from diplomatic recognition, which it would be far too premature to acknowledge. But dialogue is absolutely essential, and the government is right to have started that belatedly.
So this is a clear statement that you would engage with the Taliban. Of course, nobody in the Panjshir Valley is going to like that very much, are they? That will be seen potentially as a betrayal of those who have stood out against the Taliban, that within days you're talking to people that you have in recent days actually criticised for their human rights record.
But there's a big difference, Trevor, between dialogue and diplomatic recognition. This is a regime that came to power through violence, displaced a democratically elected government that has been going door to door, hunting the UK and people who supported the UK and the US, has been rounding up women in the last 24 hours, and has an appalling human rights record. We've got to be clear-eyed about that engagement with the Taliban, and I'm not for one moment suggesting that we grant them the legitimacy of diplomatic recognition as the government of Afghanistan. But we have to accept that because of the chaotic way in which the government has failed to plan over the last 18 months, we are now in a position where if we want to evacuate our own citizens and Afghan nationals, we've got to talk to the Taliban. If we want to uphold any of the gains of the last 20 years, we've got to talk to the Taliban. And in fact, there has been a recognition, even from the outset of the war in Afghanistan, that a new government would mean having some kind of dialogue with the Taliban. The United States has been doing it, the United Nations has been doing it, and we shouldn't change that approach now.
OK. If I may ask you about some domestic policies. This morning, the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress has called for essentially a wealth tax to pay for NHS recovery and also for social care. Is the Labour leadership going to back that plan?
Well, the first I saw about them was on the front page of The Guardian last night, and I think the broad principle that Francis O'Grady is laying out, that those with the broadest shoulders should take some of the burden, is absolutely right. fixing the social care crisis is going to cost a great deal of money, and the Prime Minister's plan, as we understand it, he hasn't shared any of the details with it, but as we understand it, his plan is that he's going to break his 2019 promise to not raise national insurance contributions and load the entirety of the cost of social care onto the supermarket drivers, supermarket workers, the delivery drivers, who are already struggling with high childcare costs, high housing costs, and who kept us going through the pandemic. I think that's a really difficult ask of a group of people who haven't done well under this Conservative government over the last 11 years. And so I think it's right to say that we need to think much more creatively about this and make sure that we don't load an unsustainable burden onto people who can't bear it.
So this is Labour squeezing the rich until the pips squeak again, which in this context, the rich includes people who live in London and the South East, for example, who have quite a lot of wealth, but it's wrapped up in houses which are very expensive. This isn't just going to be billionaires who pay this wealth tax, is it?
I don't really accept any of the premise of that statement. I think that most people in this country, every family, including my own, is touched by the social care crisis. It is breaking families up and down this country, and collectively we've got to find a way to deal with it. If that means that those who make their money out of something other than income, out of assets, pay a bit more, if it means that people pay a bit more on their income, if it means that we find some kind of compromise that is sustainable so that people who can pay a bit more do in various different ways, I think that's the right approach to take. I think we need to be pragmatic.
But pensioners on low incomes who happen to have paid off their mortgages can't, generally speaking, pay a bit more.
Well, that is the reason why we've got to learn from the failure to solve this over the last 20 years, because it is complicated and there will be impacts on people that aren't as straightforward as saying one group of people have to pay for all of this or another group of people have to pay for all of this. The Dilnot report was an attempt to try to be creative and a bit more flexible about how we manage this. But we've had this for so long now. In 2009, Andy Burnham put forward proposals that collapsed because he couldn't take the Tories with him. In 2017, Theresa May sprung proposals in her election manifesto that collapsed because she couldn't take us or other parties with her. And now Boris Johnson appears to have sprung a bunch of proposals on his own party and can't even take his own party with him. We've got to learn the lessons. We've got to work together to find a fair, sustainable solution to this that commands cross-party
Nandy, thank
support.
you.
And if the Prime Minister wants to talk about that, our door is open.